textbook begins with a discussion of the Glorious Revolution, which is fitting for several reasons. Certainly, it is a significant political and constitutional event, the overthrow of the reigning monarch, King James II, by his son-in-law, the Dutch William of Orange. The notion of calling the revolutionary events glorious highlights an insular tendency in British history, one that is often largely focused on events in England and largely disregards events elsewhere in the British Isles, in this case particularly Ireland and Scotland. The revolution is noted as glorious for its outcome in overthrowing a supposedly tyrannical king and enshrining the rights of Parliament in the settled constitution of Britain, but also for its supposed bloodlessness. Of course, the revolution was far from bloodless in the British Isles as a whole, as the revolution was certainly contested in Scotland and Ireland. In Ireland, the Battle of the Boyne was fought north of Dublin in the summer of 1690. Two armies led in fact on the battlefield by two kings, James himself on one side and William on the other. The Glorious Revolution was important for several reasons, as discussed in the text. One reason, religion, or the confirmation of Protestantism as the official state religion, was significant for the British Isles as a whole. England was Anglican, and the Anglican Church was the official state religion. In Ireland, however, the majority of people were Catholic and resented the privileged place of the Anglican Church and the place of the tiny minority Protestant population in Ireland. The Glorious Revolution certainly had a religious element to it in its causes and its effects. James II was increasingly authoritarian, heavy-handed, but most importantly he was a Catholic who sought to revive Catholicism in the British Isles in an official way. More than this, and really the last straw precipitating the actions of the group in England who negotiated with William of Orange to bring in an invasion force to England and attempt to overthrow and depose King James, was the birth of a son to James. James had two firmly Protestant daughters, Mary, who was married to her first cousin, the Protestant William of Orange, and Anne, who was married to the Protestant Prince George of Denmark, the younger brother of the Danish king. If the aging Catholic King James had died, he would be succeeded by his eldest daughter, Princess Mary. However, when James finally had a son, born in 1688, this was all too much for many English Protestants. The new son and heir, as, until 2011, males regardless of age took precedence over females in the royal succession, James Francis Edward would certainly be raised a Catholic, and thus would likely continue the Catholic revival started by his father. For Ireland, the Glorious Revolution was significant as Irish Protestants used the victory as an opportunity to punish Catholics through a widespread series of discriminatory laws against Catholics in Ireland. Known as the Penal Laws, they stripped the economic and political power of Catholics, in effect making them an oppressed majority population governed by the Protestant minority population. Catholics would not have the vote restored until 1793, and it wasn't until 1829 that Catholics were able to be members of Parliament. Having defeated King James, who eventually fled to France and lived the rest of his life in exile, William of Orange was offered the crowns of England, Scotland, and Ireland, on the condition that he ruled jointly with his wife Mary, who was again the daughter of the exiled king. Although William was not pleased by this restriction, it was a compromise, as it gave some semblance to the legitimacy and continuity of rule, in that James was succeeded by his Stuart daughter, that he was not simply deposed by right of force by his Dutch son-in-law. As noted in the text, the Declaration of Rights, which when approved by Parliament became law in the Bill of Rights, enshrined limitations on the monarchy over taxes, the army, imprisoning of subjects, and so on, and so it was an important constitutional document. In the years after 1688, there were other important developments shaping the power of the monarch and the institution of Parliament. Note that in the past, people talked of parliaments in the plural since their meeting was haphazard, not regular, and as such should not really be thought of as the powerful independent institution in its own right. In 1694, a new act, the Triennial Act, required that Parliament had to meet at least every 3 years. In essence, Parliament would become a permanently sitting institution whose power increased as that of the monarchy decreased. The Glorious Revolution had a significant religious outcome for non-Anglican Protestants, that is, to dissenters. The 1689 Act of Toleration ceased the prosecution of dissenters for not attending the Anglican Church, and for holding their own religious services, as long as their religious meeting places were registered with the state and the doors were not locked during religious services. It is important to note that this religious toleration was for non-Anglican Protestants, that is, not for Catholics. The Glorious Revolution had an impact on Britain's growing global empire, such as in North America, in India, and even on the international slave trade, as discussed in the text. The growth and extent of the British Empire became increasingly important to British power, and had significant impact on British society, politics, and economy over the next 2 centuries. To build and keep hold of the empire required money, civil servants, and of course a military to enforce British rule when needed. The Glorious Revolution helped bring about the fiscal military state, in which the military was now to be controlled by Parliament, and in which British monarchs were increasingly becoming involved in wars on the European continent. This was in part to do with the fact that several British monarchs were in essence foreigners who succeeded to the British throne, but who had a keen eye on developments on the continent in their birth countries, especially in relation to the extension of French power there. France was the power of the age and Britain's rival. William III was Dutch. George I, who reigned from 1714 to 27, was German, and so was his son, George II, the last British monarch born outside of Britain. The Glorious Revolution meant war with France was inevitable. William III was obsessed with France, with stopping French power on the continent. France was also harboring the deposed King James II, and France would furnish James with money and troops to attempt to reclaim his throne and kingdom. The 9 Years' War, from 1689 to 97, was also known as the War of the English Succession, and included an alliance on the British side to fight the French, which included Britain, the United Provinces, and Spain. The defeat of James II in Ireland should be seen as part of this larger war. This long and costly war was ended by the Treaty of Ryswick in 1697, with the English coming out on top, but not achieving outright victory. French King Louis XIV returned territorial acquisitions taken by force since 1679, and also recognized William III as the rightful King of England, though he refused to order the exiles of James II from France. Another long European war erupted in 1702 over the succession to the Spanish throne, as discussed in the text. Queen Mary died in 1694. Her husband William in 1702, whereafter the crown passed to Mary's younger sister Anne, also of course a Protestant daughter of the exiled Catholic James II. Anne was married to the Protestant Prince George of Denmark, and upon her death in 1714, the crown went to the German side of the family, the Hanovers. There were many more Catholics as potential heirs who had a better familial link to the succession. However, it was deemed impossible for another Catholic to take the throne, so the succession was fixed by an Act of Parliament. The 1701 Act of Settlement set out the succession to follow the aging William, who would be succeeded by his sister-in-law Anne. The issue that precipitated the legislation was the death of Anne's only son, the Duke of Gloucester, in 1700. The Act of Succession set the line of succession to go from Anne to Sophia, Electress of the German state of Hanover. Sophia was a granddaughter of James I. More than 50 Catholic claimants to the throne were pushed aside, including the person who in some ways precipitated the Glorious Revolution by his birth, that is, Prince James, the son of James II. The Act of Settlement significantly circumvented the formerly sacrosanct hereditary succession. Upon the death of Anne in 1714, George of Hanover, having outlived his mother Sophia, succeeded to the British throne as George I. George was very much a foreigner in Britain, in fact, speaking no English. Another important constitutional event occurred in the first decades of the 18th century, the union between Scotland and Britain, whereby Scotland lost its parliament and joined in the single kingdom of Great Britain, ruled from London. Ireland was still a separate kingdom, though it too would be joined with Great Britain in 1800 to form the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Wales had been conquered by England in the late 13th century. There had been earlier attempts to unite England and Scotland, especially when the Scottish King James VI succeeded Queen Elizabeth to the English throne in 1603, becoming James I of England. Elizabeth had not married and had no children, so the English throne passed to her cousin, King James of Scotland, who thereby became King of England. There was thus a union of crowns, but not of kingdoms. Subsequent monarchs had pressed for a union between Scotland and England, but to no avail. The matter became more pressing in the first decade of the 18th century, however, and one of the principal issues was dynastic. As noted before, the 1701 Act of Succession, passed by the English Parliament, set the succession to the crown. The Scottish, however, were not consulted in the process, although the succession would also affect who succeeded to the Scottish throne. There was thus a great fear in England that when the Scottish Parliament announced they would determine their own succession, and at the same time the 13-year-old Scottish heir, the son of the exiled former King James II, James Edward Stuart, asserted his claim to both the English and the Scottish thrones. Thus, a union between England and Scotland would provide stability and security from England's perspective. There was also an economic benefit for Scotland that favoured union, that is, the advantages of free trade in England's growing overseas empire. Thus, these factors, and outright bribery, helped motivate the Scottish Parliament to vote for its own demise, and united with England to form the Kingdom of Great Britain.